Welcome to the Don Panther Podcast.
Hello, and welcome to this podcast of Don Community High School. Today we're talking about African American history. This is an extension of our program for April 2023, where we extended the information about African American history to 8 days a week, 25 hours a day, and 366 days a year. But today we have the opportunity to speak with Professor Bernice Morris from Marshall University. He is the director of the Carter G. Woodson Lyceum. Mr. Morris, thank you for being here today.
Thank you, Mr. Williams. I appreciate the invitation.
Well, we've worked to develop a relationship between Marshall and Don High School, and you've been very instrumental in that. But first, let's talk about the Carter G. Woodson Lyceum.
Well, I enjoy talking about the Lyceum. The name originates from Aristotle's first school in 335 BC. And because of Woodson's roots in Huntington, West Virginia, where my university is located, we wanted to honor the work of Carter G. Woodson. And the executive director of Drinko Academy, who is a former provost and historian, the late Alan Gould, and I co-founded the Woodson Lyceum. And Alan liked the connection with Aristotle, but he was unaware that the Lyceum is important in education, period. I am a Mississippian and an Ole Miss graduate, and the first building of higher education in Mississippi was the Lyceum, and still is the Lyceum on the Ole Miss campus. Is where James Meredith registered. At least the riot thought they would interfere with his registration in 1962 when he integrated the University of Mississippi. And the Lyceum name has been important in Black history for many, many years. The first time Abraham Lincoln spoke out against the murder of abolitionists was at a Lyceum in Springfield, Illinois. And Ida B. Wells used to speak at a Lyceum in Memphis. Many of you know that Miss Wells was on a crusade against the lynchings of Black people, and she was a great newspaper editor as well. Our mission is to help people understand and to reconnect to Dr. Woodson, as well as encouraging people in West Virginia, the nearby communities in Kentucky and Ohio, to appreciate the impact of African Americans on history. When Woodson began, few people had much respect for Black history, and we want to emphasize some of the messages that Dr. Woodson created.
Well, you've written extensively about Dr. Woodson, and one particular article you wrote was about the early years of Dr. Woodson. Mm-hmm. Can you elaborate a little bit about that?
His early years were spent in West Virginia. And as many of you know, Huntington, West Virginia is on the extreme of West Virginia, Ohio, and Kentucky. And so when you say Huntington, you're actually talking about three states.
Yes, the tri-state area.
And Dr. Woodson's father had come to Huntington in 1870 as one of several former slaves who helped Collis P. Huntington finish construction of the railroad there. And Woodson's father remained in Huntington for a few years, helping to build what became Huntington. There was no Huntington before Collis P. Huntington moved there to finish the railroad. The city was created after that. But the living conditions were so poor in Huntington in those early years that the family moved back to New Canton, Virginia, and Woodson was born there in 1875. And one of Woodson's brothers had been to the Huntington area and came back and told the family that it was a place for opportunity, and encouraged the family to move back almost 20 years later.
He was of 9 children?
Yeah. And and so Woodson and his brother worked in the coal mines as their family moved back to Huntington. And finally, Woodson got 1 year of high school in Huntington at the new Frederick Douglass High School. There were very few high schools in the South that had in the South for African Americans. It was just a very rare thing.
Yes.
But Woodson spent a year, and apparently that's all he needed. 1 year, and he graduated from high school.
Yeah, he started.
He was self-taught, obviously.
Yes.
He taught himself the classics. Mm-hmm. And you have to be very smart to read and understand that, especially when you don't have a background in that kind of education.
Right, and then how do you convince others that what you're studying and what you're promoting is valuable when all around you is saying that the Negro has no history?
Yeah. He encountered that early on, and in 1903. He went to see Booker T. Washington speak in Lexington, Kentucky, and he was just so affected by what he heard that he was still writing about it 30 years later in his newspaper columns.
And he did not agree with Booker T?
He loved Booker T. Washington.
Okay.
He was somewhat in the middle between Booker T. Washington and W.B. Du Bois.
Yes.
Du Bois and Booker T. Washington had
they
a
were
famous
at odds.
spat.
Yes, they were.
It went on for years. But Woodson was an admirer. Now, but if you look at the education program Woodson designed, you can interpret the fact that he didn't agree with Booker T. Washington.
That's right.
But he never, I've never found any evidence that he said anything disparagingly about Booker T. Washington. But Woodson wanted people who might have been in manual labor to use that to create an industry to improve their lot, just not be satisfied with how bad things are now. And you can see that he was probably closer to W.B. Du Bois than to Washington. And it may be that Washington is mislabeled, but he has the image of one who wanted blacks to accept jobs that were soon to be obsolete.
Yes.
And he didn't. Most people who are critics of his don't see him wanting to expand the intellectual side of African Americans the way Woodson and Du Bois did.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm. Now he wrote his first book was The Education of the Negro.
Well, he wrote many books.
Yes.
His most famous book is called The Miseducation of the Negro.
Right. The first one was from 1860, prior to 1861.
Right.
And then The Miseducation of the Negro
it was in the 30s.
Yes.
And it's still being taught in graduate schools. It is an outstanding book. Unlike many critics of the way blacks were being treated, Woodson offers solutions in the miseducation of the Negro. You know, I came across a businessman from Baltimore who was planning to create jobs in the inner city, and he was asked, "What is the foundation of your business philosophy?" And he said, Carter G. Woodson's Miseducation of the Negro. And I've come across other people like that. They draw their inspiration from that book, which not only was critical of the education system, but he provided solutions to improve education. Learning more about your background and the history that had been denied, and to look at the job you have as a stepping stone for something greater.
Well, one of his famous quotes was that when you control a man's thinking, you don't have to worry about his actions.
Yes.
And I think that has been really the foundation for a lot of Black history programs and the need for African American studies. Now, there are a lot of people who question the difference between Black history, African American history, and African American studies. Do you differentiate between them?
Well, a bit before Woodson, none of those existed.
Right.
After Woodson's death, and then after Martin Luther King's death, you can see a trend of schools around the country introducing their students to Black history, and you see colleges creating Black history departments and then African and African American studies programs. But there are differences. In Woodson's day, they were Negro history,
Right.
and Woodson believed that there was a connection among all Black people, and so he didn't want to distinguish the Black people from say Nigeria and Jamaica. They were all one community in his mind, and that's been the modern thinking since Woodson. But people who refer to African American history are only speaking of blacks who are citizens in America,
from the
whereas there was a
1600s.
rich history of African Americans before slavery,
Right.
that Woodson wanted everyone to understand. And many people who use those labels, most people don't classify their citizens by race, except America.
Right.
And so you don't need to distinguish that except in America. And so you get all kinds of bad ideas when you don't understand the breadth of what Woodson and some other scholars are discussing.
Now, how do you think that his work impacted American culture?
Woodson probably was the leading exponent of African American history and culture. He was the center of action in Washington, D.C. And when you visit his home, which is a National Historic Site
Yes.
in Washington, and you're struck by how small it is versus how large his image was throughout the world. He had major impact. People from around the world would write him and ask for information about Black history, where they could find more information. And very few people were saving their historic documents when he came along and created the Black History movement. And so he would ask people to send their documents to him for archiving and sharing with the world and for research. Not many people were doing that in his day. Even the Black newspapers, where he had to admonish them about not saving their copies, because much of what we know about Black culture before now comes from the Black press.
And how did he get this buy-in from other news moguls?
Well, my book sort of exposes his strategy on that. In 1926, he created Negro History Week. He had been very critical of the churches, the Black churches, and so he was not going to get as much cooperation from them. He got a lot of cooperation, but not as much as he would get from the press. He sold the idea of of Black history being part of the newspaper history, and he was one of the first to celebrate the history of the black press. So he tied them all together. And so now you have every year from 1926 on, most of the black newspapers were turning their pages over to Woodson to talk about black history. And many who celebrate Woodson today are members of the black press. And from 1926 on, you cannot separate the black press history from the overall African American history. It was significant that they were as one, and they published Woodson's newspaper columns. And if he spoke out on black history, they didn't seem to try to document it. They just ran it.
Okay.
They bought into it.
Right. And how did it get into the school systems? Did he
That
work
was
with
another
teachers?
that was another part of
Because they
his
would
strategy.
have to have buy-in from teachers.
That was another
for
part of his
sure.
strategy. He created Black History kits for the schools. He created the Negro History Bulletin in 1937, which was directly tied to educating teachers and students about black history. He would have lesson plans, themes for the instruction. He even had essay contests. So,
Wow.
yes.
Well, and now we're talking about CRT, critical race theory.
Mm-hmm.
What would you think he would have to say about this whole conversation in
Well,
2023?
Most people who talk about CRT don't understand it, and I don't know anywhere where it's taught. I don't teach it. I have a summer teachers institute. We don't discuss it. We just stick to the facts, which is what Woodson did. Woodson didn't get involved in politics. He was political, and he was a major supporter of the NAACP behind the scenes, especially the Washington branch. But he didn't want his researchers out there giving speeches on politics, or even giving a speech at the NAACP convention. He would admonish them about becoming a race leader. So this would not have been an issue for Woodson. And if you think about it, if you're teaching the facts and reintroducing a people who had been deleted from the history books, it is a different philosophy. You're just educating people on the facts without bringing up anything that might be political or any theory. Here's it's just the facts.
So, and the controversies are basically self-imposed, I guess.
People who don't understand.
Right.
I can't imagine anyone discussing a theory except college students, graduate students. I just can't see theory being taught like that in the schools. Mm-hmm. And the people who are objecting the most don't even have teaching on that.
On a personal note, I know that Dr. Woodson was a member of Omega Psi Phi Fraternity,
Mm-hmm.
Incorporated, which I am a member of that organization too, and that was one of the ways I was exposed to him through not only the organization, but my grandmother was a resident of Huntington, West Virginia, and she always talked proudly about being a graduate
Mm-hmm.
of the school where Dr. Woodson was the principal.
Mm-hmm.
But one of the things that fascinated me was that he did not have children.
Right.
And he had a vow to celibacy and a vow to poverty. What's the likelihood of people following in that footstep today?
Not very likely. But he was so dedicated to his work. He said he
Yes.
was married to his work, and he did it nonstop. And so he didn't have time for romance, he said.
And he bought a home in Washington, D.C., a 3-story home that, as you were saying, was very small. Mm-hmm. But he lived on the 3rd floor, and he had a sala on the 2nd floor and his publishing company on the 1st floor. Mm-hmm. Are you familiar with the group of young men who worked with him called the Woodson Boys?
Oh, yeah. They became some of the leading scholars of their generation. John Hope Franklin is one of them. John Hope Franklin is probably the most celebrated of the black historians ever. and Woodson was his mentor. People who don't know a thing about Woodson know John Hope Franklin.
Yes,
and
absolutely.
several of the others who were instrumental in educating America on Black history. But Woodson influenced the next generation of scholars. Du Bois received the first PhD in history at Harvard. Woodson
was second.
Was the second. But 3 through 10, in terms of PhDs in history, Woodson had an influence on them, and probably others too. His publications used to keep count of the Black historians who received their PhDs.
All right. Well, and Dr. Charles Drew was one of his close friends too.
Yes, he did. Dr. Drew died about the same week as
Right.
Woodson did. Yeah.
Some people say they were very close friends, and Dr. Woodson may have died of a broken heart.
Yeah, and that's I had an argument with the National Park Service about that. They were close friends, but you don't use the phrase "broken heart."
Right. That was. I'm glad that you brought it up in that vein.
I remember one of my visits to Woodson's home, and they were giving this tour. And I corrected the tour guide, and later I wrote to the Park Service and complained.
Right. Well, I would encourage that. That he was a man's man. He was about scholarship, manhood, perseverance, and uplift, which are the principles of Omega Psi Phi.
And you found that phrase online?
Yes.
Yeah.
So I thought I would talk to someone who knew about it, who could give us the correct perspective on it.
I've made them nervous on my visits to the home. So usually I don't identify myself, and then they find out who I am.
Dr. Woodson did a lot of traveling too. He traveled to the Philippines.
Well, he worked in the Philippines. He was there for about 3 years. He was supervisor of a school system there.
Yes.
And he learned some of the similarities in the education of the Filipinos with African Americans. Some of the references that educators were based on Western ideology, Western civilization, and
Racist.
things that many of the Filipinos, because they were a different culture, their instructors were not using phrases and terminology that they would comprehend. And Woodson found that fault in America's education of African Americans as well. And he mentioned that in the miseducation of the Negro. But he learned from that Filipino visit, and he was able to adopt some of what he learned in his ideas for American education.
And in his education, he did get a degree from Berea College. And I understand that he left Berea College at one point.
Well, he was off and on at Berea. It took him several years. He finally got his degree from Berea in 1903, which happens to be the last year the Kentucky legislature allowed blacks and whites to go to college together.
Okay.
After that, they had to wait until the Brown decision in 1954. But the Berea degree was equivalent to like a 2-year community college degree.
Okay.
And so Woodson later got his bachelor's and master's
At Harvard.
from the University of Chicago.
Okay, and then he went to Harvard to get his
Yes.
PhD. I understand that he was also familiar or friends with Mary McLeod Bethune.
Oh, they were very close. She was one of the few people I've found who referred to him as Carter.
Yes.
Everybody
Yes, I've
else
read about that.
referred to him as Dr. Woodson.
Mm-hmm.
She was the president of his board of directors, and for a long time. And they were very close and accomplished a lot together.
Can you tell us a little bit about the organization that he founded, the ASALA?
Yeah, ASALA, we refer to today as the Association for the Study of African American Life and History. When it was originally founded, it was the Association for the Study of Negro History. Woodson founded it in 1915 on the 50th anniversary of freeing the slaves. And by launching this association, Woodson began what we now refer to as the modern Black History movement. And so you can speak of Woodson and the association as one, because Woodson controlled the association. Right. And when he spoke, you were getting the same message from the association. And they wanted to improve the education of Black people. They wanted to have Black history taught in all the schools, and they wanted economic success for all Black people.
And it took from 1926 to 1985 to get Black History Month
not 85. Woodson founded the association in 1915, and then he came up with the idea of attacking it more specifically with Negro History Week in 1926.
Yes.
But he had the thought all along that it should be year long.
Yes.
Not just 1 week.
Yes.
But he could promote 1 week, and it was easy to promote 1 week than the entire year. It was a giant step for its time. And so they didn't go to Black History Month until 1976.
Was it 76?
Yeah, it was the 50th year, and President Ford became the first president to recognize Black History Month.
Okay. Well, and that's what I understood to happen. And here's what's really curious to me. We're still struggling to get Black history inculcated into every aspect of core courses in education. And it just seems that this would be more of a priority, especially among schools whose demographics are predominantly African American.
But that's always been the case.
Not only that, but because Caucasian schools that are predominantly white also need to have the information and understanding about Black history.
Oh yeah, you're absolutely right. Woodson was successful in getting it into the schools, but a lot more needs to be done. And some of the objections to CRT is misguided, because it has nothing to do with giving people a complete understanding of history. And that's what Woodson was doing then. And I just hope those kind of objections just subside, because they have nothing to do with teaching of Black history.
The Florida governor is making
he's misguided on this as well.
Yes. Well, this has been a wonderful opportunity to speak with you and to be enlightened about the life and times of Dr. Woodson and about African American history and studies. Mr. Morris, thank you again for your partnership with Marshall and Don, and we look forward to working with you in the future.
Okay. Thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.